those who like tanks, this is the place to be. Today we're at the Collings Foundation in Hudson, Massachusetts, where they have tanks from all the way up from World War I until the modern era. Some of the tanks here include the Panther, which is over there, the German tank. This is the only one in the Western Hemisphere. The Russian T-34, and on the other side we have an M1 Abrams, the only modern American tank on display in the world.
Numbers are greater must rely on a binocular periscope. My crewmen have only a single periscope or a narrow vision slit to see power. When our tank's hatches are closed, my crew is essentially deaf and blind.
Our Panther is a formidable fighting machine. Its broad tracks distribute the tank's weight evenly, and our good suspension and powerful engine help it overcome obstacles.
The German Panther is over-engineered. Two-thirds of them have mechanical breakdowns that require special repair. And for every one Panther the German factories produce, our Russian factories produce 5 mechanically reliable T-34.
Our Panther has 18mm foul front armor slope at 35 degrees. That is superior to any T-34.
Our T-34 cannot maneuver like the German Panther. But water, mud, snow, there is no terrain we can't traverse. We must get into position to get sight al-Shah.
Wait now. Was ist los? Up ahead. Ja, tatsächlich. Russian tanks. Well then, do you see this?
Ja, Herr Kommandant.
T-34s. How many? I count 4, Herr Kommandant. Sehr gut. They can see us through this fog. Target the closest.
Jawohl, Herr Kommandant.
Main gun. Armor piercing round. Los.
The fog is lifting at last. Tavarish, Commander, Tavarish, Lieutenant, German ahead. Panther, daily hit, driver, turn, loader, repair.
Steady. We have the beast caged. Don't rush the shot.
Crank the turret, crank faster. Don't let the crowd pitch fire on us from the front. Don't let them.
Wait for it. Wait. Now, firefight. This lethal weapon of the Third Reich was never defeated in battle. Speculation has it that in the winter of 1945, while escaping from sheer numbers of Allied forces, it attempted to cross Poland's narrow Charlemagne River, broke through thin ice, and became stuck in shallow water. In all probability, its crew then scuttled this Panther so that it would not be taken by the Red Army. Nearly 50 years later, this Panther Ausf A was recovered from the Charlemagne River. Through tens of thousands of man-hours, it was restored by craftsmen of the Military Vehicle Technology Foundation in Portola Valley, California, under the watchful eye of renowned collector Jacques Littlefield. Upon Jacques' passing, the Littlefield family moved this tank and many other historically significant military vehicles to the American Heritage Museum. The fully restored Panzer V stands before you today.
Many people think wars start on the battlefield. They truly start on the home front and in factories. So what's really cool about this museum is instead of just showing the tanks and everything, like the different countries, they actually show the process of making the tanks and how a country needs to band together to actually become a war-fighting nation. And if you think about it, and unless you have the whole country working together under a common cause, you won't actually be able to win the war. So what's really cool about this is they show things like the inside of a tank turret. And even though it was World War II and tanks had started to become more sophisticated, they're actually a lot more intricate. Sorry, they're a lot more crude than you'd think. Well, you have all the technology in here. There's no insulation, no nothing. So even if you're in the middle of winter, you still have... Yeah, even if you're in the middle of winter, you have no insulation. You're just going to have to trust in the clothing you have on. But you can see it's really cool in here. You get to see all the wires and the technology. You have your flare gun right here, your machine gun with your bullets, and then you have the main turret right here. And you can see right here, all they did to store your rounds is you just have them on the floor and you just grab them one by one. What's also cool about this is they have, over here, they actually have the turbines. And what they would do is they take big pulleys and they take these tanks and they place them right in the back of the tank, just like this. And you can see with the tanks, they don't just have the tank itself, they have how they have the rolls of tracks, which they just put around the wheels, and then you have the turrets that can actually come out. They made all these things modular, so if something broke in the tank, instead of just having a useless multi-million-dollar tank, you could actually just replace parts. It'd be very easy to be very modular, so you would waste very little. So here we have a Russian T-34-76, and this is an early war tank from when the Germans were fighting the Russians on the Eastern Front. And you can tell by these tanks, they're very crudely made. So while a lot of the Germans focused on quality, and while they didn't have as many tanks, they made each tank very well. The Russians, all they cared about was pure quantity and how fast they could actually roll them out. Because before the war, what would happen was Stalin had his Great Purge. So when the Germans and the Russians had their temporary alliance, that gave Stalin enough time to actually build up his military force and rebuild the country from after his communist takeover. But so back to the tank, you can see that really Russian ideology, they did not care about quality whatsoever. They just made sure, could you fit a man in here? Can you load a round in? And can you actually shoot the tank? And it's really interesting because while it works, it really doesn't have much to it. Like if you look around, the casting is super crude. It's not smoothed out. Like if you look over here, it's just totally rough, like totally rushed out the factory because all they cared about was just pure movement. Although what's really cool about this gun, this is the later gun, and this is a prime example of that crudeness. So this is the PPS, this is the PPS 43, and this is the evolution of the PPS H41. And what's really cool about this is the PPS H41 was a much harder to make gun, and while it was super reliable, it had a lot of wood making, and this one was just a lot cheaper. So it's the same kind of thing where they don't care about evolution so much as they do just about making the war effort grow. And what's cool about this is there's a really cool comparison. Here is the German Stug tank right here, and you can just tell the difference in craftsmanship. All the welds are super neat, all the corners are smooth, the tank itself is smooth, the finish is nicer, and you can just tell that the ideology is much different. While Germans really cared about quality, the Russians, all they cared about was just crudeness and just speed to the front. The workhorse of the German army in World War II, the Panzer V, or the Panther tank, was definitely one of the most interesting tanks of the war. While it wasn't as big as the Tiger tank, this was definitely one of the most prominent tanks, and it was one of the German Army's best tanks. And what's really cool about this one is you can tell the rough sides that they put on it, and that's because early in the war, they would have to deal a lot with magnetic mines that enemies would put on it. So enemies would either run up or they'd place on mines through magnetic mines that would actually go on the tank, and they couldn't get it off, and they would just explode. But this paste and the rough paste actually allowed it so the mines would just fall off, and it would do minimal damage for the tank. And what's really cool about this tank is this tank was never defeated in battle, and instead, the Collings Foundation actually found this in a ditch on the Eastern Front. If this craft looks familiar at all, this is a Higgins boat, or an LCVP this is what landed on D-Day. So while we had other landing craft for the United States to use to actually land on islands, we used these ones just because of the pure manpower that you could actually put on it. So the objective of D-Day was just to land as many people on the beach as possible and to take Normandy Beach. We needed to use this. While it wasn't the easiest to get out of this, and while it caused a lot of casualties, these boats were definitely the best for the job because we could roll them in super close onto shore and just try to get as many people off the beach as possible. And what's cool about this one is one day when we were here, this was years ago, we actually met someone who was on this boat itself, and he actually crossed the sea, and this one was actually on D-Day. So while a lot of these tanks were just in the factory, this one actually saw action. Definitely the ugly ducklings of the war. These are two British tanks. This right here is a British Cromwell tank, and this one over here is a Churchill Crocodile tank. And you'll notice that a lot of the other tanks that we've seen, so the American tanks, the German tanks, the Russian tanks, they all have kind of a traditional look, and they look modern for the era, but these tanks look kind of weird. And this is because British engineering, so they're an island, and a lot of what they have to do themselves. And while they take inspiration from a lot of things, like the British take a lot of inspiration from the Americans, they definitely have their own look to them. Like they're very square, and while they look modern, they also have the classic feel of a lot of World War I tanks. Unfortunately, we won't be able to see any World War I tanks today. But you can just tell that the British, they didn't really care about the look of things. All they did was they cared about functionality. And you can kind of tell right here with their helmets. So this right here is it's a model of a Mark II Brodie helmet, and the Mark I Brodie helmet came out in World War I. And when World War II rolled around, they generally kept the same helmet, but they changed around the insides a lot. And what's interesting about it is they really kept the World War I design. And while didn't work perfectly for World War II, it was very good for shrapnel. And it's kind of a testament to the British mindset when building tanks and artillery and all the military armaments. And so, yeah, the British are definitely the ugly ducklings of the war. This is a true gem in this museum. This is called the Jumbo Sherman, and when the Americans were fighting the German the German Tigers, and they needed bunker busters, instead of creating a whole new tank, we just took the Sherman that we actually had and we supersized it, called the Jumbo Sherman. And there's less than 300 of these ever made in the world, and they're super rare tanks. While many of them didn't see battle, this one actually did. You can tell over here, when it took hit from Axis shell, it didn't actually separate the armor because the armor was so thick, and instead it created the splash pattern that you see right here. And these tanks are super interesting because obviously there's so little of them ever made in the world, and very, very, very few museums had them, and some of them are gone today. And just the fact that this museum has such a rare piece is really super interesting. Like, this tank is almost priceless because there's less of these than there are little things in the world. Like, there are more helmets than there are of this tank. And it's just really interesting to see this because no one really has this at all. And it's really a gift to be actually see this. And what's really cool about this tank is, unlike earlier when I showed you when Russians had very cheap labor and just cheap standards, the Americans were kind of like the Germans, with where we would actually try to do things precisely. And you can see how well the welding marks are. And while it does look a little bit rough, it's just because the amount of welding that you'd actually have to put on the Sherman to make this as big as it is just a testament to the time and the pure feat that we were actually able to do in making this tank. While a lot of other countries' tanks progress with time, this Japanese tank right here really didn't show much progression. So while other countries like the United States and Germany and Russia, their tanks were able to evolve with time and to kind of show that with the war they were able to adapt to different tactics with different tanks to fit their needs, the Japanese really just designed their tanks off of World War I standards. And a lot of this is because the Japanese were spread out over a bunch of islands. They weren't able to actually have the engineering and design to actually come up with these tanks. And you can tell with this tank, compared to the other ones, it has super thin armor. Like, this might be, it's easily less than 2 inches compared to other ones where they have multiple inches of armor. And this tank is very boxy, and unlike the British tanks where they had thick armor, this was very simple, and it's based off a lot of the old tanks, like the 1917 tanks from World War I. While those were European ones, the Japanese got a lot of these tanks early European. While other countries were able to build up their tanks and progress through time, the Japanese really just stagnated. And that's because a lot of their technology and their infantry tactics were based off of just simple bayonet charges or just staying in fixed positions and waiting out the enemy. Moving past World War II, here we have a Sherman tank from Korea. So we have the American tank like you guys were seeing earlier, but this one's the 1950 version. You can see there are some subtle differences. Other than the paint job, we have the muzzle brake, we have the updated details on the outside, you have the different treads and the different wheels. But what's really interesting about this and what stands out is the paint job. So since we were fighting in Korea, we were fighting a lot of people with Chinese and Korean traditions. And according to them, they thought that shooting at these different paint jobs of tigers and different animals was bad omen. So what a lot of the US soldiers did is they acted on Korean superstition and painted it like this in order to try to get them to shy away from shooting at this. And while it didn't always work out, it was definitely a point of interest because it would kind of have the Koreans be a little scared of it, and it would definitely be a tactic to kind of get in their heads. So if you take one last look at the tanks from World War II in Korea, you can see how much of a difference there is between that and the tanks of Vietnam and 20 years later. So you can tell that as the years progressed, the tanks got a lot bigger, the guns got bigger, the suspensions got bigger, and just the technology in them advanced quite a lot. I mean, 20 years makes a big difference. And while tanks over there were definitely the medium tanks of World War II, tanks like this were the medium tank of Vietnam. And while tanks weren't huge in the conflict, they're definitely used as mobile defense, and if a displacement was getting attacked, you can defend with these. And while they weren't super useful because Vietnam was a lot of jungles and a lot of fields, they were very good for just defense and just having a big gun with you, which you could make mobile. And what's also cool about this is you have the tanks like this versus the more Asian designs and the more Eastern designs of the North Vietnamese. And these tanks are pretty rare as well because, while you see a lot of American tanks, and obviously America has a big military culture, you don't really get to see a lot of the North Vietnamese because most people just think of the Viet Cong and just the communists in general and a lot of the Chinese. It's really interesting to see North Vietnam and how they actually had some infrastructure when most of us just thought they were a lot of guerrillas in the woods. So here we have the M1 Abrams, and this is the United States modern tank. And we've been using this tank for multiple decades, but it just hasn't really needed to be replaced at all because it's kind of a do-it-all tank. It can be fast, it can have heavy armor, it can shoot flares. It's super strong. And earlier when I showed you the different kinds of rounds in tanks, you can actually see how different they are split. While rounds used to pretty much just be a big bullet back then, they're a lot more different. And you can see weird rounds like this. This is called a salvo. What happens is this, after it goes off, the shelling around it actually breaks apart. You pretty much just shoot this giant arrow at whatever you're trying to hit. And what's interesting is we went from a lot of a lot of big bullet stuff to now we're pretty much just hurling arrows at each other like we used to be. And if you look over here, you have a lot of the tanks that came before the Abrams, and a lot of them. So you can kind of tell they look more like the Vietnam tanks that I just showed you, but they definitely have the modern feel to them. They've adapted to modern combat in the desert. You can see all the desert camouflage and the helmets. They're a lot different and they're kind of evolved. And on this one, you can see this tank's been around for so long. We've actually had multiple helmets on it. We started out with this helmet called the Hasket, which was the helmet of the 1980s through the 2000s. We upgraded to the ACH, the Advanced Combat Helmet, which is mostly used today. It takes all of the good parts of the Hasket and streamlines it in terms of your helmet, pads, and a glider system. Here we have Russian T-55, and as opposed to the Abrams that I just showed you, this is the modern Russian tank. And you can tell that, like how they were in World War II, they're a lot more basic, and instead of going for quality, they're going for quantity. And instead of kind of going for long-lasting, they only want them to last as long as they'll last in battle. So if you have a tank that is only supposed to last 3 battles, only build it to last for 3 battles and not try to prolong their actual use of materials. What's interesting about this one is, while the tanks have definitely progressed since the World War II tanks, it seems like they're kind of following a lot of Western ideals with just bigger tanks with long, bigger guns. But they still have their own Russian flair to it, and it's very basic. And like I said earlier, the Russians aren't quality, they're more quantity based. Alright, so that was the American Heritage Museum, and if tanks aren't your thing, they have a whole separate museum dedicated to planes and race cars throughout history. And yearly they do different events, like today's Tank Day, where they have all the tanks rolling out. And they also have Battle of the Airfields, where every year they do a reenactment of Allies versus Axis in like a World War II style shootout. And they have the different factions winning every time. But yeah, so thank you very much for watching. This is the American Heritage Museum, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.